who will be speaking on Oakland businessman FM Borax Smith. Phil is a longtime Oakland resident. He has a keen interest in architectural history and historic preservation. He previously served on the OHA board and as the editor of the OHA News. For more than 30 years, he has led tours of FM Smith's Oakland estate and his early borax works in Nevada. Phil is now retired after working for 40 years in public health and healthcare in the East Bay. He can frequently be found hiking the trails of the Bay Area and the Sierra Nevada, and currently volunteers with the Bay Area Ridge Trail. This presentation has a large number of images illustrating the lecture content. Be sure to minimize your chat bar and enlarge the computer window to full screen to get the fullest visual appreciation of the images. Phil will speak for nearly an hour, and when he's done, one of our board members, Daniel Levy, will read out questions that are typed into the chat room. And so here's Phil Bellman with his lecture on the life and legacy of FM Borax Smith.
One quick note about questions. Feel free to ask questions during the lecture in the chat. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat icon, and if you click or tap on that, it should open up a chat function. So feel free to type in your questions as the lecture is going on. You don't have to remember them, and I can read them off at the end.
I just want to check we've muted everybody. I'm sure getting a lot of dinging here.
I think everyone's muted. I think those dings are people joining.
Okay, we'll get started. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure and really great privilege to present an overview of the life and legacy of Francis Marion Borax Smith, a man who forever changed the course of Oakland, the Bay Area, and California. And I want to acknowledge some of the people who've contributed to both to the research and the images used in this presentation, especially Steve Beck and his sister Mickey Alice and the grandchildren of FM Smith. Over the years, they've given me so much information and so many historic pictures, many you'll see tonight. Other photos come from the Oakland Public Library and the Oakland History Room. I want to acknowledge Ron Hook and Tim Lane out at the Western Railway Museum. And I see Preston is on the call, Preston Chiaro and Marilee Mitchell with the Death Valley Conservancy. Also UC Berkeley Bancroft Library and the Mills College facilities staff were all really helpful. And just a shout out to all those who have contributed to the Smith walking tours over the many years. But especially, I want to acknowledge the work of the late George Hildebrand, who authored the superb 1982 book, Borax Pioneer, Francis Marion Smith. George was an economist, a historian, and a friend of the Smith family who taught at UC Berkeley and Cornell for 35 years. This is the most comprehensive work on Smith. It's out of print, but you can find it online still today. Tonight, we'll view both historic images and present day images. I have to warn you, besides historic buildings, there will be a lot of children, trains, and mules. So this is the story of Francis Marion Smith, known as Frank to his friends, but Borax Smith to most of the world. Smith was one of Oakland's most famous, colorful, and at times most successful entrepreneurs. He developed an international borax industry. He built major estates here in Oakland and in Long Island. He organized the East Bay's first major system of transportation, the Key Route. He was a major philanthropist of many Oakland community causes, and he saw his entire empire collapse in a year into ruin and bankruptcy. And in his 70s, he came back and regained yet another fortune. 100 years ago, there existed on Park Boulevard one of the most palatial estates on the West Coast, the fabled Arbor Villa. It was the home of Francis Marion Borax Smith. Smith's enormous mansion was called Oak Hall. It was built between 1893 and 95. It had 42 rooms with 15 bedrooms, a pipe organ, a bowling alley, a billiard room, music room, and a ballroom, and a miniature borax mine. Beyond Borax, Smith's business enterprises shaped present-day California in so many ways, changing not just mining, but railroads, urban transportation, and East Bay land development. This is also the story of two remarkable women, Smith's wives, Mary R. Thompson Wright and Evelyn Ellis. So F.M. Smith was born in 1846 in Richmond, Wisconsin. He was the son of a prosperous farming family. In 1867, at age 21, he left his father's farm with $200. That's about $3,600 in today's dollars. After prospecting in Montana, he ended up in Nevada. He started several unsuccessful restaurants near Reno and Wadsworth along the path of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was still under construction. Now, to explore Smith's early career, let's head out into the desert lands of Western Nevada. We'll start here at Mono Lake, and we're going to work our way east. So we might drive out Highway 120 over into the Benton Valley, passing through the old town of Benton Hot Springs, established in 1852. We're already beginning to get a sense that there's some history here. We'll head on up into Nevada, up Highway 6 and over Montgomery Pass. And pretty soon we're not seeing many people. In fact, we're more likely to see wild horses, burros, or pronghorn. We don't know how Smith spent the next 5 years, except that he was following different mining strikes. These likely included the Comstock district at Virginia City and the so-called Southern mines in the area of Marietta, Belleville, and Candelaria, east of Mono Lake. The Southern mines were originally based upon silver, and these are current day pictures of the ruins of Candelaria. And it was silver that drew Smith to the region, but luck as a prospector would elude him. So he became a woodcutter, providing wood from nearby mountains for the mines and smelters. About 1871 or 1872, Smith presented himself to a borax refinery operated at Powell and Chestnut Streets in San Francisco by Joseph Mosheimer and Emil Stevenow. He told them of his interest in borax. There were no borax jobs in the city, but Stevenow offered him a job at Columbus Marsh near Candelaria as a woodcutter. Large quantities of scrub pine were needed for boiling operations to concentrate cotton ball borax. Smith took the job, and the history of borax in California was forever changed. Now, just a little refresher, borax. It's also known as sodium borate, a boron-based compound. It's found in desert regions around the world, including the dry lake areas of Western Nevada, Death Valley, the Calico Mountains, and today near the town of Boron, California. It was first used as early as the 8th century as a gold flux, and later as a pottery glaze, glass hardener, and burial preservative. Today it's used in glass and fiberglass, tile and ceramic glazes, household products such as soaps and detergents, in fuels, epoxy resins, welding, mining, as antifungal agents, and as a food additive. But our story of F.M. Smith really begins here at Miller Mountain. It's almost 9,000 feet high. Smith is cutting wood for the borax works at Columbus Marsh, and he builds a small cabin high on Miller Mountain. And in October 1872, he views the gleaming white deposits at Teals Marsh to the west, about 40 miles east of Mono Lake. After a visit, he promptly stakes his mining claims, and the rich deposits turn out to be the purest borax found anywhere in the world at that time. By early 1873, Frank and his brother Julius arranged to have the firm of Story Brothers of Chicago build a refining plant at Teals Marsh, and they began production. The refining process involved raking the cotton ball borax in windrows and carrying it in wagons to the refinery. And these are pictures of the works as they exist today. Then steaming the borax mixture in large wooden tanks on a hill. And then drawing off the solution into metal crystallizing tanks. And eventually the pure borax was refined and bagged for shipping. But as we walk around Teals Marsh borax works today, there is evidence of a largely untold story. The workers, many were Chinese. There are large quantities of Chinese pottery sherds, porcelain, whiteware, earthenware, stoneware. Many Chinese men arrived during the California Gold Rush. Most came from Guangdong province in southern China. The Central Pacific Railroad in the 1860s recruited and employed 13,000 Chinese workers to help build the Transcontinental Railroad over the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. After 1869, many Chinese returned to work in California or went back to China, but about a third stayed on in Nevada to work in mines and railroad construction. By 1880, 9% of Nevada was Chinese. It's likely the Chinese workers played a critical role in the success of Smith's borax ventures. Between 1873 and 77, Smith used 24 mule team freight wagons to carry ore 160 miles to the railhead at Wadsworth. That's east of Reno. Each double wagon freight team could transport about 30 tons of borax. And 160 miles through the desert, it's a long ways. Here's a later picture of a borax wagon unloading onto rail cars. But Smith was not the first to discover or process borax, but he figured out how to get it to market, and he was good at marketing, a true entrepreneur. Smith promoted borax as a solution for practically everything, including getting rid of bed bugs, ants, moths, and cockroaches, for disinfection, stains, and sunburn, preserving milk, killing vermin germs, and of course as a laundry detergent and household cleaner, and hundreds of other uses. From this pamphlet, From the Desert Through the Press into the Home, the use of borax is the foundation of a clean, healthful home. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Borax, borax, borax. He established an office in New York City and soon persuaded the world that everyone needed borax. In the first year of production, the Smith Brothers Borax produced 1,000 tons of refined borax worth $500,000, which is about $11 million in today's dollars. At age 26, Smith was already known as Borax Smith. It was during this time he made frequent trips to the Bay Area, often staying at the Tubbs Hotel in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Oakland. It's at the Tubbs Hotel Smith met Mary R. Thompson Wright from Brooklyn, New York. They married July 14th, 1875 in Brooklyn, New York, both aged 29. They go back to live in Marietta for 5 to 6 years. And this is a picture of the remains of the Smith Brothers store as it still stands today. And I have to tell you, if I had to go live 5 days in Marietta, I think I'd have difficulty. The idea of living out there for 5 to 6 years is really staggering. But it's here that Mary R. read the book, Blade of Grass, by English writer Benjamin Farjan. It tells the story of 2 orphan children, one of which had the good fortune to be raised by a kind family, while the other did not. It later inspired Mary to establish cottages for orphan girls. In 1881, Frank and Mary R. moved to Oakland to the little gray house on the north side of East 17th Street. And they lived there for 2 years. During the 1880s, Smith rapidly expanded his borax interests. By 1882, the Carson and Colorado narrow gauge railroad was completed to Candelaria. Now borax could be taken by wagon from Columbus Marsh and Teals Marsh to the railroad, and then shipped on the Slim Princess to Mound House near Carson City, and then to the Transcontinental Railroad to market. The CNC was later extended over Montgomery Pass down into the Owens Valley and all the way down to Owens Lake. Part of this line operated as narrow gauge in the Owens Valley until 1960. And you can still hike parts of the old rail line along Montgomery Pass on both sides. It's really quite beautiful, and there's old stonework. It's very interesting. I recommend it. In 1883, Smith with W.T. Coleman started the Harmony Borax Works in Death Valley. So this is about 11 years after he starts the Teals Marsh. They used the now famous 20 mule team borax wagons to haul borax from Death Valley to Mojave, and a legend is born. I just want to note these beautiful pictures. From Marilee Mitchell. These wagons were reconstructed by the Death Valley Conservancy about 3 years ago. And they're brought out, they live at the Laws Railroad Museum. Where, anybody else lose picture?
We still see your screen, Phil.
I'm not. Okay. There we go. Must have hit something. Anyway, they currently live at the Laws Railroad Museum just outside of Bishop, and you can go and see them. And every year on Memorial Day weekend, they're hauled out for Bishop Mule Days. Although this year they're not having a parade because of COVID. But plan to go there next year in 2022 and go see these when they actually hook these wagons up to 20 mules. And I just want to say the interpretive piece here at the museum is great. If you forget about mules, mules are the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. This hardy hybrid was chosen to pull the wagons due to their intelligence, sure-footedness, and stamina. Mules require less water and food than horses. They also live longer and can pull more weight. And a quote from Harry S. Truman said, "My favorite animal is a mule. He has more horse sense than a horse. He knows when to stop eating, and he knows when to stop working." While U.S. production of borax tripled in 5 years to 11 million pounds, in the 1890s, Smith acquired mines in the Calico Mountains at Borate near Daggett. He consolidated several companies to form the Pacific Coast Borax Company. And Mule Team Borax was added to Smith's borax label with a sketch of the famous 20, and still used today. I just bought this box at Berkeley Bowl a few weeks ago. Smith also failed in an attempt to use a Best steam tractor called Old Dinah to haul ore in Death Valley. It still lives at the Furnace Creek today. And he formed a multinational borax corporation with British partners. And he built a new refinery in Bayonne, New Jersey, and US production reached 16 million pounds. By 1907, Smith also completed the Tonopah and Tidewater Railroad, the TNT, through the Amargosa Desert to haul borax from Death Valley. Meanwhile, back here in Oakland, Smith bought his first Oakland streetcar line in 1890. By 1893, he consolidated nearly all of Oakland's independent horse car, cable car, and electric railroads that had 4 different gauges. And in 1895, he also forms the Realty Syndicate Company with partner Frank C. Havens. They acquired 13,000 acres between Mills College and North Berkeley, including all of what is now Montclair. The company's offices were in the Realty Syndicate building at 1440 Broadway. Built in 1904, expanded in 1911, is still called the Syndicate Building. By 1911, the Realty Syndicate controlled $10 million in real estate and had developed nearly 100 residential tracts The company reached a peak in 1911 and probably did more to develop Oakland than any other single firm. And he began planting trees. Smith had a great love of trees, and nearly all his enterprises involved planting trees. In 1902, Smith forms the San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose Railroad, the original key route. By 1903, the key route inaugurates Transbay ferry and train service. It had 270 miles of railroad. It had 6 Transbay lines running every 15 minutes, 800 trains per day, more than Penn Station in New York, and a 3-mile pier where the Bay Bridge is today. The commute from Berkeley to San Francisco Ferry Building took 38 minutes, a real system. BART and AC Transit today follow many of the same key route right-of-ways. And the Key System building was built in 1911, designed by Frederick Meyer, still stands at 1100 Broadway, although it's towered by a few tall neighbors now. And Smith built the Key Route Inn in 1907 at 22nd Street and Broadway and began work on the Claremont Hotel in 1905. It was finished in 1915. These were destination hotels to attract potential buyers to the land schemes of the Realty Syndicate. He was also a partner in the development of the Hotel Oakland in 1912, which later hosted many visiting presidents. And he was involved in the Ransom Rock Quarry and the Ransom Branch Railway, was known as Leona Quarry, and it's now housing, and also the Leona Sulfur Mines in Laundry Farm Canyon above Mills College. With the success of Smith's rapidly expanding borax business, Smith could well afford to build an estate in Oakland. In 1882, he acquired the Tubbs and Matthews Ranch, which was 53 acres. By 1883, the Smiths had moved into the old Red House here, later to be the site of Oak Hall, his grand mansion. The Red House was later moved to the corner of 8th Avenue and East 24th Street. Here is how it appears today on East 24th Street. It's a city landmark. For the next 13 years, Smith developed the grounds and gardens of his new estate, Arbor Villa. The name came from the numerous rose and grape arbors. Arbor Villa was bounded by Park Boulevard, then called 4th Avenue, East 28th Street, and 9th Avenue. It had 3 main entrances, all had grand gates. Smith loved nature, and Arbor Villa had lavish gardens and grounds. They included archery range, croquet grounds, tennis courts, lily ponds with rare fish, groves of pine, birch, and redwoods, extensive lawns, paths, and gardens. And since he was a farm boy, fruit orchards and vegetable gardens. He had a zoo with deer, peacocks, llamas, cats, and rabbits, and this wonderful observation tower. Lots of pictures of the observation tower. Here's a big party at the observation tower. And here you can see the view of the observation tower looking over towards the Smith Cottages and the Bear Hills. And he brought his small miner's cabin built in 1872 from Miller Mountain. But in 1893, Smith began construction on his new home, Oak Hall, which would take 2 years to build. It was designed by Walter J. Matthews, one of Oakland's foremost architects, with much consultation from Mary R. Smith. Shingle style, Queen Anne Victorian, it cost $275,000. That was compared to $5,000 for a large house in those days. It was massive, 136 feet wide at the south main entrance, 114 feet wide at the west carriage entrance, had 42 rooms, including 15 bedrooms. Had a 2-story entrance hall with a gilded pipe organ, and a bowling alley in the basement, and wine cellars, and a billiard room with inlaid floors and panels of burl redwood, and a music room, glass enclosed conservatory filled with exotic plants, a drawing room with custom woven tapestries. And this ballroom and theater, completed 4 years after the rest of the house, with a fully equipped 36-foot stage and a ceiling painted to look like a Japanese parasol. The library cost $45,000 for just this one room. Inlaid floors and paneled ceilings and walls completely of tropical koa wood, and a grotto under the carriage entrance with a little model of a borax mine. Walter Matthews' brother, Arthur Matthews, designed the interior, and many furnishings were designed by Bernard Maybeck when he worked with Charles Plumb and Company in San Francisco. Maybeck had come to San Francisco to work on a project with A. Page Brown. It wasn't ready to start, so Maybeck took a job designing furniture with Charles Plumb. His father had been a furniture maker. And this is the carriage house. Magnificent. I'd live in the carriage house, I don't know. And Smith had a 1900 Studebaker Landau, an enclosed carriage. It's now owned by the Oakland Museum. It was used to host visits by 3 US presidents, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and here William Taft. And Arbor Villa was the site of many Oakland social events, charitable parties, dinners, balls, weddings, outings for children of the Mary R. Smith Cottages, church functions, and more. Smith hosted annual parties on the annual villa of the Arbor Villa grounds, open to the entire community. This photo says there were 5,000 people at Arbor Villa for a May Day garden party at a time when the entire population of Oakland was about 60,000. The proceeds went to charity. And Mary R. Smith often sponsored women's suffrage group meetings here. And of course, there were mules. The 20 mule team was trotted out for fairs and parades all over the country. Here's the team in downtown Oakland at 9th and Madison Streets on their way to the Panama Pacific Exposition in 1915. And there's a great irony because this is, building still exists in this picture, you can see. And it's right across the street from the Lake Merritt BART station. But Arbor Villa wasn't Smith's only estate. Près de l'Eau was built between 1892 and 1900 on Shelter Island in Long Island, New York. It had 35 rooms, vast landscaping, lagoons, and a private harbor. Little remains today. Each summer, the Smiths would load up their family and staff on his private rail car with a Pullman car and head to the East Coast to spend 4 to 5 months at Près de l'Eau. FM could escape from business to enjoy time with his family, as well as riding, sailing, yachting, tennis, and, quote, taking the sun. Here's a photo of Smith's custom designed sloop, Effort 2. In the late 1880s, Smith financed inventor Ernest L. Ransom. In 1889, Smith built a new refinery, borax refinery in West Alameda to extract borax from colemanite. It was a crushing, reduction, and refining plant all in one. It is believed to be one of the first reinforced concrete factory structures in the United States, constructed using Ransom's new process. In 1931, it took dynamite to tear down the abandoned refinery. The Ransom process was also used to build the Alvord Lake Bridge in Golden Gate Park in 1889, the San Francisco Ferry Building in 1896, and here, the Japanese Bridge, 1897 at Près de l'Eau, all still intact today. Ransom and Smith later formed the Ransom Concrete Machinery Company of Dunellen, New Jersey. And in 1904, the Smiths sponsored the design and construction of El Campanile, the clock tower at Mills Seminary, now Mills College. The stunning 5-story Mission Revival Tower was designed by Julia Morgan and reused bells from the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. The tower used Ernest Ransom's new process for reinforced concrete and was built by Ransom's contractor son. It survived the 1906 earthquake without a crack and helped launch Julia Morgan's career as both an architect and an engineer. She would go on to design many other buildings at Mills College, as well as buildings for Mrs. Smith. El Campanile, might be noted, was built just 2 years before Frank Lloyd Wright would use reinforced concrete in Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. Then there's the solid six. The Smiths had been unable to have children and adopted a daughter, Marion Frances, in 1883. And from George Hildebrand, he says, her great adventure began in 1883 when a tiny auburn-haired infant in arms was brought to her and was given the name Marion Frances Smith, thus becoming their foster daughter. About a decade later, the two Burge sisters, Anna May and Sarah Winifred, joined the family in their very early teens as wards, having no near relative to care for them. About 1895, Charlotte Grace Sperry, a niece of F.M. Smith through his sister Julia Sperry, also became a ward following her mother's death. Then in the late 1890s, Evelyn Ellis joined the growing household as financial secretary to Mrs. Smith. Finally, Florence Nightingale, a young singer who had been trained abroad, also came to live at Arbor Villa. With her addition, the family came to include 6 young women who F.M. Smith habitually referred to as the Solid Six. They were a remarkable group in many ways for their intelligence, their diverse talents, their good looks, and their devotion to Uncle Frank and Aunt Molly. Although in this unusual way, Mary R. Smith did gather a kind of family around her husband and herself, her deep need for motherhood still went unsatisfied. In 1901, Mary R. Smith established the Mary R. Smith Trust for Orphan Girls, a group of cottages on the north side of Park Boulevard. Mary R. wanted to establish homes for friendless girls. The idea for the cottages was inspired by the book Blade of Grass about English orphans. The 34 acres were a Christmas gift from F.M. Smith. And here's an article of interest to women. It says, Mrs. F. Marion Smith has founded a colony of little orphan girls who are to be brought up in pleasant homes, educated, and then given a start in the world to make them self-supporting. According to Mary R. Smith, the object was foundation, endowment, and maintenance of a Christian home for orphan and other helpless girls, wherein they shall be cared for, supported, educated, and their individual talents developed, so that they may become self-supporting, self-respecting, and useful members of society. There were 15 trustees, all women, members of the First Congregational Church of Oakland. And each cottage was run by a, quote, widow of refinement, with 10 girls at the economic level of a, quote, prosperous mechanic. Each mother ran her own cottage and bought food and clothing. The allowance was $100 a month for 10 children and $5 for each girl able to support herself. The children were ages 4 months to 16 years. They kept their own names and went to public school, and the mothers would take the children on summer excursions like to the Russian River in Santa Cruz. There were 9 cottages in a building called the Lodge. Each cost approximately $5,000 furnished, had 12 rooms with an attic, basement, and guest room. Most interiors were made of redwood. They were furnished with a piano and sewing machine, and each had its own garden, lawn, and fruit trees. 1901, they took in the first girl. By 02, they had 23 children, and by 1920, they had 9 cottages and 73 girls. All the cottages closed by about 1934. Here's a view looking across Park Boulevard around 1910. On Park Boulevard, formerly 4th Avenue, we see the Trestle Glen picnic line of the East Oakland Street Railway. In 1893, the Oakland Traction Company had extended a trolley line up 4th Avenue to Grosvenor Place with a wooden trestle over Indian Gulch to Sather Park. The street became known as Park Boulevard and the Indian Gulch area as Trestle Glen. There were pine trees planted by Smith all the way up the north side of 4th Avenue to Hopkins Street, where MacArthur and the freeway are today. In the foreground of the photo, we see 2 of the cottages, Mary Evelyn Cottage on the right and Evelyn Cottage on the left. On the hill above the cottage is the Home Club, I'll talk about in a second here. There are 7 of the cottage buildings remaining. 4 are designated city landmarks. Here's Evelyn Cottage on Park Boulevard. It was designed by Julia Morgan. The next building on Park is the Lodge. It contained the offices and meeting rooms for the trust. It's still in very good shape. In fact, the interior, it has one of the most original interiors still intact. It's a home for the clerk of the trust, Mrs. Green, and her 2 daughters. Then there's Marion Cottage. This was their first cottage in a historic picture here, designed by prominent Berkeley architect Bernard Maybeck. The Smiths refused to pay his exorbitant fee of $400 and later paid on advice of their attorney when the fee was reduced to an acceptable $250. Note in this view, we're looking across Park Boulevard. You see the observation tower up on the hill, and on the right side, we see Oak Hall over there, and in between, a cajillion trees. Today, this cottage is kind of overgrown and really difficult to see from the street. Up the street, we also have Initial Cottage. And on McKinley, Florence Cottage, greatly modified. And Josephine Cottage on Home Place East has some new buildings built in front of it, but it's really quite intact. And Grace Cottage on McKinley too, it used to have 2 floors. Then there was the Home Club. It was Smith's idea to have a neighborhood community center built between 1903 and 04. Designed by Walter J. Matthews. Classical revival. The facade had a grand entrance with large columns. It contained classrooms, ballroom, enormous kitchen, art gallery, lecture and reception hall with stage. Initially housed a kindergarten, sewing and cooking classes. It was used to house refugees from San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. Events included Christmas celebrations, concerts, social and educational events. And you can see this big walkway up from Park Boulevard. Unfortunately, the stone stairs still exist today. According to the Oakland Tribune, it was a mecca for East Bay's smartest socialites. There were lectures by Jack London and Mayor Frank Mott. The trust vacated the home in 1926. And the last owner was the German pioneers of Oakland, known as the German Pioneer House. The art gallery was transformed into a gymnasium, and the grounds changed to resemble a German garden. They held concerts and exhibitions of folk dancing. In its last years, dances were sponsored by 12 East Bay German societies to finance it, but a midnight curfew imposed by the city because the neighbors were complaining resulted in financial ruin. It was sold to the Oakland Board of Education in 1958 and was raised to make way for the Oakland High School portable classrooms. And now it's a parking lot. So in 1905, Frank and Mary R. celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary on December 30th. The next day, Mary R., at age 59, died of a stroke on the eve of a trip to visit Europe and Egypt. But in 1907, Smith, at age 60, married Evelyn Ellis, age 29, in the old red house. Remarkably, Evelyn was born in England at Eastington Hall. This photo from 1900. It says it was built in the reign of Henry VII. She came to Oakland with the Ellis family at a young age. We think this is her on the right side of this picture in the 1880s. The Ellises go on to become good friends with the Smith family and later live in the red house. We think this picture is actually taken in front of the old red house. She served for 10 years as Mary R. Smith's financial officer and personal secretary. And like Mary R. was an independent, intelligent woman, she reportedly had the word obey left out of her marriage vows. For their honeymoon, Frank and Evelyn and his niece Grace Sperry traveled in Smith's private rail car to Miami. On Smith's steam yacht, they toured Nassau, Cuba, and Jamaica. And here in their their wonderful swimsuits, bathing at Port Antonio, Evelyn, Frank, and Grace. On the trip home, they stopped at the Grand Canyon and rode mules down the Bright Angel Trail. But Smith was eager to get back to business. Hildebrand writes, Evelyn's partner was anything but a doddering old man. At the age of 61, he was a multimillionaire, controlled the biggest borax company in the world, and at the same time was well embarked upon his development of the Key Route, the Oakland Transit, and the Realty Syndicate, not to mention the building of the Key Route Inn and the Claremont Hotel, ownership of 3 banks, a local chemical company, and the operation of a half a dozen mining ventures in California and Nevada. Smith's marvelous reserves of energy enabled him to keep a firm hand upon all these diverse enterprises while setting a fast pace for all his younger associates when it came to getting things done. Between 1907 and 13, Frank and Evelyn have 4 children, Mary Evelyn, Dorothy, Mildred, and Francis Marion Jr. Here's Smith enjoying his new family at Pratelot. And a more formal colorized portrait. And grandson Steve Beck just related this very funny family story to me. He said that in 1918, during the Spanish flu, when their parents decided to remain at Pratelot to avoid the risk of infection in New York City, the children were enrolled in the local school, attending with the children of mostly farm families. The Smith children made up stories about life in California. The one I remember was an attempt to describe the steepness of California's mountains by explaining that cows and sheep were bred with legs longer on one side than the other, so they would not fall down the hill. Well, it was during about 1910-13, Smith always made quick, sometimes high-risk decisions regarding business. His net working capital was often perilously thin. Smith was always increasing his massive short-term borrowing in pursuit of further expansion of his businesses. Hildebrand sums up Smith's problems by saying, Smith's primary difficulty was that his reach tended to exceed his grasp. In financial terms, his practice was to borrow short, to invest long through demand notes, call notes, and fixed term notes. His brother-in-law, Norman P. Ellis, describes Smith as a borrowing capitalist, a man who built great ventures largely upon short-term finance and who regularly sweated blood at the end of each year as his notes fell due. His failure to secure permanent financing for his many ventures proved his undoing. In 1910-1913, Smith and others attempted to form United Properties Company, a large public utilities holding company, but United Properties failed. And Smith's assets were turned over to a committee of bankers. Smith, bankrupt, lost all his borax and transportation holdings. People laughed when Smith said he wanted to re-enter the borax industry, saying it was impossible for him to compete with the now large corporations he had founded. But as Hildebrand notes, Smith was an individualist, an old prospector, and a fighter, a man who thought in days rather than years, and who was always ready to take a risk when the prospective profit was large. 1921, Smith, at age 75, bought newly discovered borax deposits in the Muddy Mountains south of Las Vegas for $250,000. The anniversary mine was later valued at $10 to $60 million, which is $150 to $900 million in today's dollars. This ended his 8-year struggle to get back on his feet financially. Smith successfully now used Caterpillar tractors to haul 10-ton trailers 26 miles to the railhead. Smith also used airplanes in the early 1920s to survey for borax. He jokingly said he would call his new product 20 airplanes borax. And Smith's West End Chemical Company had a large refinery in San Francisco. Its offices were later located on the second floor of the Latham Square building in downtown Oakland, where it existed until its merger with Stauffer Chemical in 1956. Its stock was bought for $27 million, or $265 million in today's dollars. By 1925, borax wars had driven the price down from $200 to $16 a ton. And Pacific Coast Borax began consolidating mining claims in the Kramer district, first discovered in 1913 near modern-day Boron. The newly found deposits turned out to be 1.5 miles long, a half-mile wide, and 200 feet thick. By the end of 1920s, most other borax mines had closed. Today, it's the site of a large open pit mine owned by Rio Tinto Borax, formerly US Borax, supplying more than half the world's borates. In 1928, Smith was disabled by strokes. He retired from business. Evelyn Smith took control of all Smith's business affairs. The Smiths finally gave up Oak Hall and moved to Van Buren Avenue in Adams Point near Lake Merritt. On August 27, 1931, F.M. Smith died at age 85 after breaking his hip in a fall in his new home. He died at Fabiola Hospital, which later was to become Kaiser Permanente Oakland. Upon Smith's death, there was praise for the Borax King from all sectors of the community. The Oakland City Council and mayor issued a resolution declaring Smith, quote, our esteemed, kindly, and public-spirited friend and citizen. He unfailingly displayed throughout his life a fine civic spirit and loyalty that was not only helpful and inspiring, but contributed immeasurably to the advancement, upbuilding, and welfare of the city and her people. Other accolades came from the numerous newspapers, the Key system, churches, and other civic groups. So what became of Arbor Villa? The estate was intact until 1921. Homes were built on the north side of 9th Avenue. The grounds and gardens were destroyed. 1924, 1926, the first subdivisions were sold. The observation tower was burned as a promotion. An ivy drive was carved through the front lawn. And the first, quote, high-rise apartments were built. 1930, Arbor Villa furnishings and art collection were sold. Here's an article showing the auction of a Thomas Hill painting of Yosemite. In October 1931, the remaining lots and house contents were auctioned from the Oakland Tribune. Today's the day, 1:30 is the time. Now for the greatest event in East Bay real estate history. Realize what this rarest opportunity of all means to you. The forced liquidation of such a wonderful piece of property comes once in a lifetime. You and a few more wise men and women alone can profit by it. Only a few more hours to inspect the subdivided home place of Borax Smith. Some things to be saved: hardwood oak leaves carved by hand and inlaid in hardwood floors, panels of rare woods, carefully matched ancient foot tubs and flower-decked washstands, graceful balustrades and pillars of solid mahogany will all look alike to the wrecker's crew. Oak Hall was torn down January 1932. The last public tour was in October 1931. And this is the site of Oak Hall today. It's not very scenic. And this is the views of would have been some of the Arbor Villa gardens. A Smith's minor cabin from Miller Mountain was offered to the city of Oakland as a memorial to Borax Smith, and the city couldn't find a site for it, and it was reportedly destroyed by a tree falling on it before it could be preserved. But despite the oncoming depression, new apartment buildings and commerce soon sprung up in the subdivided Arbor Villa. One is even named the Arbor Villa Apartments. Here's a beautiful building on Ivy Drive, which was the previous front lawn of Arbor Villa. And the Montezuma, next door, the Montezuma Apartments on East 24th. From the Oakland Tribune, this apartment building will be complete and modern in every appointment and detail. The design will be Spanish. Each bedroom has a full-length plate mirror in the closet door. The kitchens are enameled in individual color combinations with the tiling, electric ranges, and linoleum selected to harmonize with each color scheme. Genuine Frigidaire is also installed. On Park Boulevard, we get this beautiful building, this streamlined, modern apartment building. And on McKinley, the Sharon Apartments, 1928. And over on Home Place East, this Art Deco boat ship style with kind of rounded windows. And on Cleveland, another kind of Mission Revival. And of course, the Cielito Lindo on McKinley, designed by Case Bolt Dakin. There was also neighborhood storefronts built on the property about 1930. These mostly have been converted into residential use today and artist studios. And of course, the palms. On the east side, Arbor Villa was lined with Mexican and California fan palms. This row of trees, a city landmark, is the most visible remnant of the old estate. Smith planted palms all over, including many at key route stations and at Furnace Ranch in Death Valley. Many of these trees remain today. And also intact is the Mrs. Clara J. Smith house on Capel Street. This is just above where the cottages were. Smith's older brother, Byron, followed FM west to assist in his businesses. He later pursues mining and mercantile businesses. After his first wife, Minnie Miller, dies, he marries Miss Clara Miser. The house is built by the Realty Syndicate for Mrs. Clara J. Smith in 1911. But Byron dies at the age of 70 in 1911, only a few weeks after his new daughter, Daphne Byrona Louise Smith, is born. He lived in their house only a few days, but Clara lived in the Capel Street house at least until 1918, and it still remains today. So remembering F.M. Smith, besides F.M. Smith's legacy in mining, transportation, real estate, industry, and the community, some places and events remind us of his life. Remaining in the Arbor Villa neighborhood is the F.M. Smith Park and Recreation Center on Park Boulevard. The land was given to the city by the Smiths in 1912. It has 4 mule sculptures donated by Smith's children. It also includes a gravestone for Smokey, a good mule. The mules were rescued and restored a few years ago through the efforts of Steve Beck, Smith's grandson. And I found this next picture really fascinating. It came from the Smith family. It was 12 years after Smith's death. The Francis M. Smith Liberty ship was launched in the Richmond Kaiser shipyards in 1943. There's a striking parallel between F.M. Smith and Henry J. Kaiser, born 36 years after Smith. Both come from modest backgrounds. Kaiser's father was a shoemaker. Both were exceptional entrepreneurs and go on to establish major industries that alter the course of California. And both are buried at Mountain View Cemetery, as are, I should note, Julia Morgan, Bernard Maybach, and Thomas Hill. So here's the Smith Mausoleum at Mountain View Cemetery. In it lies F.M. Smith, Mary R. Smith, Evelyn Ellis Smith, Byron Smith, and other members of the Smith family. Sitting peacefully on a high hill, it overlooks the city Borax Smith transformed. But if I had to guess, I believe the spirit of F.M. Smith remains out at Marietta and Teals Marsh, where his great adventure began. When you visit there today, you can definitely sense his presence.
Thank you, Phil, for that really wonderful presentation. I think you brought him to life, and it was great to see the arc of his journey and how it kind of connects to Oakland. And I think I'll have a new appreciation when I go on your walking tour of seeing all these images. I think it's really great to see them up front. We got a lot of questions. I can go through them. The first one was from Neil. Where was Smith during the Civil War, and what was he doing?
A good question. I know that Byron Smith served in the Civil War, And but I've never heard anything about F.M. Smith in the Civil War.
Hmm.
And
Cool.
Mickey Allison wants to comment. Can you unmute yourself, Mickey Allison?
yes, Mickey or Steve would be the ones to answer a lot of these questions.
Mickey is gesturing.
Yeah, everyone, you should be able to unmute yourself. There should be Mickey, there should be a button on your screen, maybe on the lower left.
So I have notes says that Byron Smith was a veteran of the Civil War, having served in one of the crack Wisconsin regiments.
Okay, let's see if I can find her in the list. I think I can. Okay, there we go. I think I can ask her to unmute. Let's see if that works. Oh, there we go.
Okay, two older brothers were prisoners of war during the Civil War. And they, his mother went out and actually went down and stayed with them because they were both hospitalized. My grandfather was too young at that particular point in time. He was not age-wise for the Civil War.
Yeah, so he was 21 at the age of, at 1867, so.
Well, okay, 1867, and I guess maybe he was out in California. I mean, out west.
Yeah, so that's say when
Because
he
He
when
was
he left
not in the
home.
war.
Right.
It's just the two brothers.
Thank you for that. The next question we have, was there any friction between Smith and his former employer, who was also mining borax, when he went out on his own? Do you know if there was any kind of contention there?
Oh, now you're really into complicated things. I think the Hildebrand book goes into quite a bit of detail. There's so many different kind of business relationships involved here. I mean, when he first starts the Teals Marsh, he's in partnership with his brother Julius, as well as the Story brothers, who helped build the mill. And eventually they all drop out, and Smith buys up other properties. He had quite a complicated relationship with Coleman, W.T. Coleman, and who started sites, but it was really, you get the feeling that it was Francis Marion Smith who was really the driving force, in sort of developing these properties. There had been smaller borax works in California, Nevada, Oregon, but it's really Smith who kind of comes and begins to really organize this into an industry.
And kind of as a follow-up question to that, was it primarily marketing that made him such a success, or was there anything about the process, or purely marketing?
Well, I'm just gonna hazard my opinion. I think, yes, I think it was marketing. It was people he hired for marketing, and he had people involved in marketing who were very good. But it's also just an incredible drive, I mean, like I say, Teals Marsh is a long ways from anywhere. The idea is a young man in his 20s would go out here in the middle of Nevada desert and then somehow persuade somebody in Chicago to come and set up this borax works. It's just staggering to me. I mean, it's really hard to understand. George Hildebrand kind of describes that he's the epitome of what you would describe as an entrepreneur, somebody that's kind of basically driven and unstoppable, that he gets an idea, he's ready to innovate, he's willing to try new things and take big risks, to the point that he goes bankrupt, in 1913, but that still doesn't stop him,
Wow. Yeah, that brings me to the next question from Margaret, is how did he travel from Oakland to the mines? It sounds like a pretty long journey.
Well, initially, I mean, the only way you would have gotten there is by horse or wagon. By the early 1880s, the Carson and Colorado was built out there, and that connects all the way to the Transcontinental Railroad and to the Bay Area. In fact, it's really interesting when you explore sites like Teal's Marsh and Candelaria. One of the interesting things have found there are oyster shells, fresh oyster shells, which meant that they were farmed here in the Bay Area, packed into sawdust, put on the train all the way up to the Transcontinental, and then shipped down probably on the Carson and Colorado down to the mining towns, so.
Great. The next question we have is, do we know if borax really did work for all the purposes that it was marketed for?
Oh, well, I think it's a little like OxyContin or something, it's today. Yeah, it was literally, I mean, I just picked out a handful of examples there, but I mean, there literally, if you look at the list from the 1890s, it was hundreds of things. I'm sure a lot of those things did not really work or do very much, but he persuaded people they did, and sold a lot of it. I mean, it's still used. It was primarily used for household uses in those days. Today, its use is much more industrial. So it went on to become very useful, and the transition of that from household use to modern industrial uses is probably a really complicated story. Oh, we see a nice note here from Preston. He would know a lot about this. So being with the Death Valley Conservancy.
Great. Gray asked, what was the relationship between the Realty Syndicate and Mason McDuffie?
I don't know.
Okay. We have another question from Neil about if Smith's love of nature was similar to Olmsted's, that is beautiful, calming, green, groomed for human benefit. Do you know about any sort of relationship between Smith's view on nature?
No, other than this kind of obsession with trees,
Great.
And of course, it's not kind of the environmental type view that we have today. In fact, I mean, one thing that sort of staggers me is when you visit these sites out in Nevada, what you needed to process borax was heat and water, and there's not a tree to be seen. I was actually out there a couple of weeks ago, and I kept thinking, are there really trees up on Miller Mountain? And sure enough, if you look with your binoculars, you can see trees up at about 8,000 feet. But I can imagine this mining was actually pretty devastating, in terms of both water use and vegetation,
Yeah, especially out in the desert. That brings me to Andrew Alden's question: was Smith involved in the eucalyptus plantings in the high Oakland and Berkeley Hills?
Not that I know of, but I don't really know the history of that. I know they were brought in with the idea that they were going to be used for lumber, and that didn't work out.
Mickey Allison is gesturing.
Okay, he says yes.
Let's see if I can.
I wonder if we could just unmute Mickey and Steve.
And he was involved with the eucalyptus. I heard that from my grandmother as well as from other people. But it's he was a little bit embarrassed because they thought they had gotten something that would be lumber, and it didn't work. And so I'm a Sierra Club member, and I have to sort of be embarrassed by the fact of it a little bit. But I also find it funny.
All right. Amelia Marshall asks, are there photos of the Solid Six riding up Diamond Canyon with FM Smith in their pre-breakfast rides?
I've never seen those pictures, but maybe Steve or Mickey's really the one with the great photo archives. So
Let's see.
about the only picture I've seen is the one we shared tonight. It's common, I believe it's in the Hildebrand book, and it's the only one I've really seen.
Helen asks, can you talk about your sources for a minute, about your expected and obscure?
The sources?
Yeah, like source, where do you find information, about FM Smith and,
Well, really the biggest source is really Hildebrand's book. And Hildebrand, it looks like he spent about 15 years putting the book together. And as I understand it, he was a member of the First Congregational Church and knew FM Smith when he was young from the church, and their family became friends. And he became a very good friend of Evelyn Smith. And after her death, at least what he writes in his book is that the children asked him to write this book, and it's impeccable. I've been using this book for 30 years. I don't think it's a very rare that I find anything in it that I can find any contradictory information about. So that's probably the best factual information about his lives. As far as the photographs, most of the photographs, the historic photographs, come from the Smith family. There was a great album of Arbor Villa that all the children had, and one of the copies of that lives at the Oakland History Room at the Oakland Library, and you can view it there. And then some of the other photographs come from the Bancroft and other miscellaneous sources. It's been a real challenge because this has not been my regular thing on the walking tour to feature these kinds of pictures, but it's really kind of interesting.
Great. I've been catching up in the chat. I made it so that people can unmute themselves. I think, David, you had a comment that you wanted to make, and sorry if any of the grandchildren hadn't been able to comment. You should be able to chime in if you weren't able to before.
Single person.
Hello.
All the scenes, and it was just beautiful.
Hi, David.
My sister,
Oh, hi.
Ramona, who,
Let's see, but I'm trying to mute him. Hi, this is David Wofford, and I'm the co-chair of the Rotary Nature Center Friends at Lake Merritt. We're stewards of the wildlife refuge there, and that involves sharing with people the fact that it's we just celebrated the 150th anniversary of it being designated the first wildlife refuge in the United States, and the history of Samuel Merritt and others, and the role that they played in the development of the lake. And coincidentally, I'm also, the last few years, been working with the Oakland Museum in the early California history section, specializing in the time before the other people came and the gold rush period, and taking and giving tours and guides to people. And I say that by saying what a wonderful presentation and program. Oh, wait, I live across the street. I've been doing all that for the last 5 years, but I live across the street from FM Smith Park on 5th Avenue. And I love the park, and I visit there, and I've known of him all my life. But what a wonderful, awesome program. And I wanted to thank you so much. You brought such, I wanted to reference my own background because you brought it to life so vividly and so wonderful. And there was so much detail that I'm hoping that I may be able to join you in sharing the information with the world more so.
Thank you, David. David's my neighbor, so it's always good to see him on these calls. Did any of the grandchildren have any comments that you guys were trying to unmute? You guys, Mickey, I think you should be able to unmute.
I will just share one thing. There was a question about whether or not he was named for the swamp fox. And during that time, that was very common. So the swamp fox was considered a hero, and it came multiple times, and that was one of the pieces of information I got. I will share one thing very much so, because he's referenced in the book, the Hildebrand book, that he is descended from William Paul, who came in 1620, and Lemuel Paul, who was a revolutionary soldier. Those are all true. But what he didn't know, and I discovered during my family history bit, was that William Paul was a Scotsman, and he was not, came into Plymouth and did not quite rub well with the Puritans. And so he got, essentially was fined for drunk and disorderly over and over and over again. He got in battles with people, although his wife, he ended up marrying a woman who was, father was extremely well loved in the community. But he, prior to that, he actually got pulled up and charged with adultery and was whipped in both Plymouth and in Taunton. I went along with the wife. The husband was put in the stocks because he hadn't taken care of his wife. And she ended up wearing a scarlet bee for blasphemy because she swore so much. And I just thought that is kind of a unique kind of thing to find out. And literally in the DAR museum, and have a little old lady came up and say, "You found your black sheep," when I started laughing. So it's sometimes kind of fun to do family history because you can find some really cool things.
Thank you. We had a couple questions about artifacts. Do we have, Phil, do you have any idea of why the Oakland School District didn't want to keep the home club and incorporate into the high school? And maybe also, do you know where some of the Arbor Villa artifacts or, parts of the house might be today?
I can't speak for the Oakland School District of 1956. It did seem a little short-sighted. They tore it down because they needed to expand and put in portable classrooms, is my understanding. As for the artifacts, the only records I have is that, they were members of the First Congregational Church, and I've been negligent in ever checking this out, but I heard that that some of the furnishings went to the First Congregational Church in Oakland. It's there on Harrison.
Great.
I just wanted to say one thing about the sources. Over the 31 years that I've led the walking tour, part of the experience has been the people who've come on the tour. Not only did George Hildebrand come back in the 1990s, I know the Becks have come on the tour several times, but I also had, one year I had a man whose mother had worked at Oak Hall and traveled with Smith to Predolo, in about 1910, 1911. I had another woman come on the tour one year, and she told me how her mother had been one of the girls in the Cottages, and the one impression I really have come away with is that I've never heard a negative word about this man, that he seems to have affected lots and lots of people's lives, and throughout his time, and it was kind of, even though he was a hardcore businessman, he never seemed to have had a kind of a negative image, at least that I've ever read or found.
Thank you. We'll get down to our last couple of questions. Chris Patilla says, can you talk about the Borax Museum, and maybe also, Teal's March? That it seems kind of not much is going on there. Is there any sort of effort to preserve that, or
I don't know too much about the Borax Museum at Boron, I presume you're talking about. As far as Teal's Marsh, Steve might know more, but it appears to be on BLM land. A lot of that land was sort of checkered, so some of it's private and some of it's BLM land. the only reason it exists is that you can't see it from anywhere. It's almost impossible to find. If you were just to go out to Teals Marsh and look for this thing, you probably won't find it, because there's no road close to it.
Muted. Now
And,
you're unmuted.
Phil,
Phil,
Yeah,
something I discovered in a recent visit there about 3 years ago, when I ran into a geologist up in the Excelsior Mountains, is that there is an organization called Dajin Resources, which is doing some testing as to the extent of lithium there, which is becoming very important here as we go to more and more electric vehicles and for batteries for electric vehicles. They built a couple of roads out on the western side of the marsh with test sites, but they haven't done any work there because they've got another property near an existing lithium mining operation over more towards gold south of Tonopah or southwest of Tonopah and west of Goldfield, Nevada.
as far as the artifacts,
Oh, I did have a man call me after reading about me trying to get those mules restored and put up a new
I wouldn't
exhibit,
give them too much of that. It's kind of rich.
who
somebody needs
gave,
to know.
yes, who gave me a piece of the what do you call it? I have a roll of,
Wallpaper.
it's not really wallpaper, it's too heavy for that, but it came from the house that somehow he and his mother were able to get in there and help themselves. And when he learned about me, called me up and came over, visited him. He presented it to me. Since I have it here in my closets in my bedroom, because I
Don't know where to put it.
really don't know where to put it. And but anyway, I'd like to say there's actually 2 albums of Arbor Villa, one done the year or 2 after it was completed, and then the one that all the branches of the family got, that was done about 5 or 6 years later after all the vegetation was matured. But I waited till my aunts had passed on to avoid any possible criticism. I loaned it to the library at the history room.
The Oakland Library.
Yeah, the Oakland Library, in the history room. And after I learned that the last of the children of F.M. Smith had passed on, I sent them a letter saying that they could consider it a gift and a permanent, their property permanently. So it would be available to the public. But it's interesting to see the difference between the new plantings and how much different it is after they'd had a chance to grow up.
Thank you. I think that we'll end the questions here. We'll have Charles wrap up, and then it seems like there's a lot of excitement. So if people want to chat afterwards, we can do that too. So Charles, do you want to wrap up, and then after we formally end the meeting, people can chat and.
Right. Thank you for attending the lecture tonight. It's been very informative and interesting. We'd like to welcome you to upcoming Oakland Heritage Alliance events, including another lecture in about a month, Candy Makers of Oakland, to be given on June 17th at 7 p.m. by Kathleen D. Giovanni. And then watch your emails. We're planning to have some in-person, a reduced season of in-person walking tours coming up in not July and August, but late August, September, and maybe October, dates to be determined. Oakland Heritage Alliance, with your support, we advocate for historic preservation. Our recent efforts in preservation action have included the Howard Terminal Ballpark Project, the City Downtown Plan, and the redevelopment of the California College of the Arts campus at College and Broadway. We invite you to become a member of OHA if you are not already. As a member, you will receive our newsletter and have access to our many events: walking tours, lectures, building tours, studio tours, and house tours. Thank you for attending this evening's presentation. Recordings of our online presentations are available on our website, www.oaklandheritage.org.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Phil.